Hey,
Right.
how's it going?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Not too bad.
Good. We are desperately rushing around to get the second dedicated customer onboarded. And so I might, depending on what if people ping me, I might have to jump off, but we'll see.
Oh, cool.
It's one of those deadline-y type situations.
Is the launch, the deadline today? You're onboarding today?
No, it's actually Friday, but really tomorrow. Um, and as is always the case, then today we just discovered like some nice fat bugs that we need to fix, which are great. And the thing, well, as you know, like with this Terraform stuff, if there's a bug in what you've provisioned, it's much harder because then you need to be able to kind of take the
Yeah,
existing clients
migrate.
and bring them through, right? Yeah, migrate and it's not just another deploy. It's kind of like every single thing is a really complicated database table migration.
Yeah. Anytime we had to reprovision our like GitLab instance that was running on Kubernetes, like we were just
Yeah,
like pull back up and restore new cluster. We're not doing any
yeah.
failover. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, well, we've just discovered that the Postgres database is encrypted with the wrong key. So it's the same thing. It's like, yep.
Yeah. We had that happen one time where we lost like I think the Helm chart like started off by like auto generating it, right? And we lost that secret. And but
Oh,
luckily it was like the first 2 weeks they read provision the instance, right? So we never had that problem again. But yeah.
yeah, we're gonna have to do some sort of custom migration.
All right. Since we're at time, I'll go ahead and um, start things off. The first question I had was to anybody who participated in the previous architecture kickoff working group. Does anybody know where the recordings for those meetings ended up? Because I haven't been able to find them on YouTube or Google Drive. Okay, I'll keep digging then. But if anybody like stumbles across them, just let me know async because that would be great. There's like a couple of the meetings that I'd like to catch up on after reading the notes, and I can't find them. So on to two. Last week we discussed alignment on problem statements, and Eric in particular brought up under I think it was 1B last week, the importance here, and I quoted something that he had mentioned down below, that the highest impact thing we can do is looking at how we can incorporate into the next prioritization process. And I 100% agree that that's the main problem that we should focus on solving here. Um, at the same time, like I I think if we hyper focused on that problem, that would be a great solve and that would be super effective. But there's a couple things that I wanted to make sure that we still captured. So I've tried to define like the proposed problem statements that I'd like to add to the handbook page after this meeting under 2C. Um, the two things I didn't want to leave off the table were the consolidation of downstream processes with the blueprint process. So that would be like production readiness reviews and AppSec reviews. I think by like following the architecture evolution process and producing a blueprint, you should be able to get a lot of that for free. And anything we do to streamline that process, I think bolsters um, the, the the point about prioritization. Because if the process is more efficient, then taking advantage of it as part of the next prioritization becomes even better. And the third one is a bit more forward leaning. Eric mentioned that um, you know creating some sort of like unified roadmap is not something that we're going to solve in the short term. And I agree with that as well. But at the same time, I feel like we, in addition to not having a unified roadmap between product and engineering, I think we sort of have a lack of unified roadmap even just within engineering. And that alone makes it difficult to, compare what we want to get done versus what product wants to get done in any sort of like cohesive manner that allows us to pit new feature development against architecture changes or other maintenance activities that we want to execute on. So that one's sort of just to plant a flag in the sand. I think, ideally we would still unify those roadmaps at some point in the future. But as far as this working group goes, I think we can look to enhancing the blueprint process and making it the means for defining engineering's overall roadmap across all departments.
So
Anybody have? Sorry, go ahead.
I guess I don't disagree with the result, but like the way I think of it is like the closest thing we have to like engineering's roadmap, right, is essentially it emerges from this engineering allocation meeting, where here we status the big sort of like engineering driven projects that we're doing at any given time. If we were to lay these things out on a Gantt chart, that would be our roadmap. So we could probably, as just thinking in terms of small iterations, we could figure out a way to kind of like produce that. Like just take each one of these, get the best idea of start and end dates from the DRIs, and just put them on a Gantt chart. Or even better yet, like if we build epics around them and we could power our portfolio management feature set, it would be in GitLab. And then we have, then we have something. And then we can, I think that helps, arm us for the conversations about like how to advocate that these projects, a lot of these projects are very cross-functional, right? So thinking back to when we eliminated sub-transactions from the code base, that's something that would have hit many, many different teams. So what we'd have to do is we've got this project to eliminate sub-transactions. We've got the backlog identified and all the different teams are going to have to do it. And then every release, every team that's involved is going to have to take a bite out of that backlog. So it's a very cross-team, cross-functional project. And that's really important to get right because the PMs are very functionally oriented, right? So like they only think in terms of their feature set, right? And that's one of the reasons why historically it's really hard to get something like, hey, PM, like just understand the value. You need to like delay some features because you have to remove all sub transactions from your thing. That totally disrupts their product roadmap, which makes sense. It's not their view into the same information. So I think we're closer to having a roadmap than it maybe appears. And we could just, if we just visualize this document in that form and look at an artifact, I think it'll become clearer what it is and what the next steps are.
So do you not think it makes sense to encapsulate the items in here as blueprints or some sort of like refined blueprint that's different than the ones that we produce today?
I don't think everything in this engineering allocation doc requires a blueprint to action it. I think some certainly do, like functional decomposition of CI is something that would be scream for this type of work, right? Other things are kind of a different character of work. So I'd say like, there's some overlap, but not complete overlap in the Venn diagram of engineering maintenance or engineering allocation projects and things requiring blueprint up front.
Okay. The reason I think it would be good to define them as blueprints or some sort of like lighter weight proposal that is still like managed as code in the same way, it is just that it's a good communication tool, and like you could do that with issues and epics too, except that like I think the reasons why we produce blueprints as blueprints today rather than being in issues and epics is so that we capture that history, and any changes to the plans are version controlled.
Issues, epics, and blueprints are not mutually exclusive, right? So like we have to you have to track work items, and that's what issue and epics are for. And the blueprint is really where like the technical vision is. So
Right.
what I would do is if someone could take an action item to kind of like go through the latest engineering allocation agenda, put it into a Gantt chart view. You can use a spreadsheet, you can use a Gantt tool, you can try to use their own portfolio management feature, kind of dealer's choice. And then we can look at these things next meeting and say, okay, like this is the subset that deserves blueprints. And then, you know, if you want to make a big push to go back and retroactively do blueprints for all of them, that's a valuable exercise. I think that'll be very clear, like if that's the case and what the effort would be to do that.
Okay, I'll take that action.
Cool.
And this may not be the best example, but like the one I had in mind was like when we look at stuff like pods.
Oh, for sure, blueprints. Oh, yeah,
Obviously,
yeah.
that's a blueprint,
Many
right?
blueprints. Yeah.
But even something that's a bit smaller than that, that requires like the same sort of like change in mindset or change in engineering culture, I think is important to document in the form of a blueprint, just so when people are building new functionality, they have the future state in mind, right? Like today, we shouldn't be building anything new that's not going to fit nicely in a pod architecture, right? So like people should be thinking of things as like decomposed by default, right? Horizontally scalable, out of the box, ability to run stuff in a pod-like architecture, right? But we don't have a blueprint for pods, so there's nothing for us to like. I mean, aside from pointing to the deck, there's nothing that we can point to so that like when people are engineering solutions, they know they need to engineer it to this future spec to some degree, right?
Yeah, potentially. It's going to be hard to reconcile that with our kind of like iteration value and our muscle memory. But I think there's certain cases where we dig ourselves into a hole and we have to spend time digging ourselves out.
There's also, Eric, a lot of the examples you used were around like technical debt. And I think, you know, particularly with sub-transactions, it's kind of like a task that everyone needs to share and kind of break up and do. And to some degree, it's kind of a by rote task, like everyone just needs to go through their code base and stop using sub-transactions. But then there's a lot of places where actually you want a blueprint for like an idea for new feature or some new part of the product. Obviously, I'm working on dedicated at the moment, and everything we're doing is new, and we always start those. That it's not technical debt, it's new feature development, and we start that off with a blueprint because it's a way of kind of syncing on what we're actually doing, so that everyone's got the same idea, and we'll kind of argue and argue and argue in the blueprints as a way of kind of all kind of syncing across ourselves. And then, you know, other things like CAS or like let's adopt WebSockets for real-time updates. Like those are things that they're not really feature or they're not debt, but they're features, but it's still really good to use some architectural blueprints as a way of syncing across the organization. And then the last kind of example I wanted to use, just one more, is things that we don't really have yet and aren't really an engineering allocation, but maybe should be. And I haven't attended engineering allocation for a while, but you know, I'm thinking of object storage or, you know, file upload and those type of things. So they're not like classic technical debt, but they sort of, we want to go to a better place than where we are right now. And so
yeah, I think that's a good way to think of it. Like if we don't have a great definition of what deserves a blueprint and what doesn't now, like that new forward-looking feature is a good way to think of that. So I think like there's I care about getting all the maintenance stuff wired up to the cross-functional prioritization process. There's a subset of that is what you're talking about, Andrew, and what you're talking about, Marshall, that also requires blueprints, right? So I'm trying to serve many goals at the same time. But yeah, there's so yeah, let's look at it and see like, okay, what's based on what's in the engineering allocation agenda today, what does a Gantt chart look like? Which ones don't have blueprints that you all think should have blueprints? And then let's see, you know, what we do next from there. Do we go back and create them all, or is there some other source of projects that are being thought about. Like I assume the dedicated stuff isn't in engineering allocation, so might want to go and cull other types of projects as well.
And if I just look at, like, I see the last one is from the 19th. Does the latest engineering allocation meeting represent the full current state, or do I need to go back a couple weeks to get all the items?
Everything that's currently outstanding should be in that July 19th update.
Okay, great.
If you wanted to assemble a longer Gantt chart and go back in time, you could go down the agenda and there would be projects that are now closed that would have been open at a previous point in time.
Okay, yeah, I'll look at doing that too. I think the discussion we were just having is a good segue into 3, where I think we could use. I think it'd be useful to have better terminology than architecture, because I think a lot of folks have a different opinion on what architecture means. And to Andrew's point, I think there's things that we would not categorize as architectural changes that require a similar level of coordination, but aren't like new features either. Like I think another good example, aside from the ones Andrew mentioned, is like if we were to look at migrating the JavaScript code base to TypeScript, right? That's certainly something that I would expect to follow the evolution process and have a blueprint around, and would probably consider it maintenance. But to me, it doesn't. Architecture isn't the right term to describe that. I mean, it can't. I think you can easily shoehorn the term architecture to encompass most things, but I think in terms of communication, it's not clear amongst folks what an architecture blueprint is or what it's for.
And I think by most folks, the entire world is not clear, consistent about how they use the term architecture.
Right.
But one thing I put in there is that I'm certain that people will always use that word, right? So I think you, me and Philippe all agree, like we should have clear terminology here, no controversy there. I'm on the fence about whether or not we should just use the term and own it and define it, rather than try to ban it and then people will use it anyway. And it'll just keep adding to the confusion. And my instinct is probably that we should kind of like lean into it, but like really, constrain what we mean and don't mean by it by good naming conventions, but open to thoughts.
I think the risk is that so the front end engineers have a sort of like RFC process where they hash things out, and I'd love to see, like, I think the risk is if regardless of how we define it, if people take a glance and they say, oh, architecture blueprint, well, that's much bigger than what I'm proposing, or like what I'm proposing is not an architecture change, that they would go and create their own process or use issues and epics where a blueprint would be more ideal. So I don't want to. I think there's risk in scaring people off to not following the process. And that's where I think like some looser terminology might be helpful. But
open architecture.
Yeah.
So I'm
architecture
sometimes
for all.
Yeah, I'm sometimes trying to avoid using the term architectural blueprint because I know that for some people it might be a bit scary. Instead, I sometimes decide to use the term design document or architectural design document because it's like feels a bit more lightweight than architectural blueprint. So we can probably use that term interchangeably.
And a lot of times I just use the term blueprint, right? Like just dropping the architecture prefix, I think is also better. And that would be a relatively small change. I don't know what we would do about the overall process. It's called the architecture evolution workflow. But I think like blueprints are a good word. Like I don't see anything that you couldn't.
Yeah, design has its own name collision, right? So like there's other design artifacts in the design department, UX design, all that stuff. Jerry kind of initiated the blueprint term years ago at this point. So like it exists. If we all committed to kind of like owning it and reinforcing it, then that, then we have a shot of just kind of making that understood and make that the boring solution. So we would just, I think we'd have to be just kind of rigorous. So like when people say architecture, say like, oh, like here's how, here's how we think about here. And we call it blueprints and stuff like that. So do people want to, do people want to just kind of like centralize around the blueprint term and, but like strengthen it and make it more common, more ubiquitous, maybe do away with the architecture evolution workflow and call that something, blueprint something?
Yeah, we could, renaming the overall workflow is the harder part, but we could call it like
technical blueprint process or something.
Yeah, yeah. I don't have a strong opinion there. I can work on some stuff in an MR and we can hash it out async.
I was just looking through those front-end RFCs quickly, and they seem to have quite a good process going there, and I like the collaborative way that they're working. I just noticed that there's no front-end engineers in this group, and maybe there should be, because they can probably bring some experience and expertise.
That's a good call. Yeah.
Good insight.
And like, yeah, to be fair, the only thing I don't like about their process is that it's hard to find what the decisions were, right?
Because it's all in an issue. And
exactly.
Then
no, it's in the code. You just read the code, Andrew. It's just JavaScript.
It actually looks like it might be TypeScript according to that. But no.
Well, I hope we're involving our community if we're going to do that, right? That's a community decision.
Does anyone know who sort of led that RFC process? Because they're probably the right person to. I'll ask around. See if we can invite someone.
Tim is always a good entry point into anything front end, although he's on vacation for a couple of weeks. So maybe Martin, I think, is one of his kind of close managers.
Yeah. Okay.
I want to say,
I'll ask him.
Like, I think Chad told me how all that got started, but I forgot. So he might know as well if you have trouble.
Okay, I'll ask around. Thanks.
Yeah, I have the next point in the agenda. I wanted to touch it before we run out of time. We are working on this interesting architectural blueprint. We are calling that. There's a working group we are collaborating in with some. It's about building the next rate limiting architecture or the next application limiting framework. And it's by its nature very cross-functional again. And part of the problem statement here in this working group is how do we get very cross-functional initiatives eventually implemented? What tools and processes should we use, like the next prioritization process, to get it done? So I think it might be very interesting mental exercise. How do we actually get this blueprint implemented? As it's done, it's still very early in writing, and we will refine it in the next couple of weeks. And once we have it merged and approved, and we know that we want to commit to building a better rate limiting framework, how do we actually implement that? Because like historically, blueprints like that usually get stuck. We have the GraphQL blueprint. We have never been able to make progress on it. We have the object storage blueprint, and we could not make any kind of tangible progress with it either. So,
and then this is why wiring it up to the cross-functional prioritization process is so important, because that is intended to be the lever to actually get this stuff through. It is up to us to kind of like demonstrate, articulate the business value of these things in the form of availability, resiliency, security, whatever the different angles are. But that's why I want to make sure, amongst the other things we do, we're meeting that interface, because that's where the rubber will hit the road. That's one of the things we're hoping to change.
I think that in case of the next prioritization framework, it might be easy when you have a set of issues. Like, let's say that there are 10 or 20 issues you distributed amongst groups, and PMs can actually schedule them and get them assigned. How do we get something done where in situation where we don't have this backlog, this roadmap describing issues and epics, and it's something that requires a bit more focus than one person picks this issue, another person picks that issue, and there's no focus in when they are working on the whole story.
Yeah, I think generally the approach should be like we have to sort of propose that project, right? So like we do have to turn it into issues. I think it's been effective in the past to sort of like phase things, and Dedicate is an example. They clearly articulated phases, right? I think some of the challenge you articulated requires like a dedicated team of people that are going to do something, who really can just kind of own it and they live with the project the whole time. Then other aspects in each phase need to be farmed out to the other development teams and need to be picked up as maintenance in the cross-functional prioritization workflow process. And so, maybe one of the other things we need to think about here is how we have, maybe we're a little bit more fluid, like for pods, like we're going to have a podding team and whatnot, and that's not controversial. We have the sharding team to do functional decomposition. Maybe there's a way for us to use some of the hopefully flex time we have amongst our senior ACs to just kind of like self-organize into these teams and be like, we're going to focus on this together, regardless of like forming a team and naming it and reporting to the same manager, just so we have that like consistent ownership over the life of something.
Yeah, and I think for the initiatives that would only take a couple of months, like working groups aren't a bad organizational structure to do that, and they would be more effective if EMs were like dedicating engineering resources towards them. Like one of the biggest problems is that like it's an ad hoc group of people that like are not committed to implementing the exit criteria of the working group. They're just working on it given the time that they have. So yeah, I think a combination
EMs never could before. Like EMs didn't have the bandwidth to dedicate engineers. All that was prioritized by PM, right? So, but under the cross-functional prioritization process within maintenance, they will be able to do that, and then we'll be able to get that sort of like consistent participation that, totally agree, has been missing. It's made it hard to drive these things.
Yeah. So I think between a combination of working groups and then for the longer term stuff, spinning up new product groups under like platform or enablement, between those two, I think that would be a good solve. And
scalability in infrastructure for certain things would fit their charter.
Yeah. I thought scalability was under I guess platform as a whole is under infrastructure.
I think, isn't platform a dedicated team?
Platform is above, it's Marin's area, so it's the scalability,
okay.
Delivery, dedicated and FedRAMP teams.
Yeah, so then so scalability as part of platform, Marin's initial insight was like, we just can't get some of this stuff done. So let's put back-end engineers that are normally in the development department in the infrastructure department, so they're no longer under the auspices of the product prioritization framework. And then they could do whatever we wanted them to do. So that was a strong move and it was effective, and we've kept that. Cross-functional prioritization is meant to kind of like formalize the official prioritization of this stuff, while having just say, we're pulling people out of the org, so you're not in charge of them anymore, because we want to make sure that we're collaborating and we're adaptable.
So I think that it means that if we want to implement the next rate limiting architecture, we will probably need to find engineers in organizations that are interested in working on that, and then trying to allocate their time through the next prioritization framework in a way that they can maintain focus. So presumably they would focus that on this effort full time if it's possible. If it's not possible, then it's not. But is that something that we are thinking about, Eric, to get things like that implemented?
Yeah, I think maybe based on the time frame, whether it's a working group or some other way for senior ACs like yourself to kind of like coalesce and provide that stability for the project, then you can go get the interested people. I think finding the interested engineers is a part of it, right? But like relying on volunteerism just doesn't work. You get that from your community, but once you work at GitLab, you're scheduled, right? So that's where we have to work with. We have to work through the new prioritization method, and if that's identified, then whoever's up gets that issue. It's always better if someone that's doing the issue is someone who's aware and passionate about it, right? So that's where it's like it's a nice to have to do what you said, but we still have to solve something needs to officially be carved out amongst our development department bandwidth.
And along those lines, Eric, do you think that we should look to defining some sort of process that's analogous to the current engineering allocation process, so to like be the glue for this like multi-EM coordination? Because like one thing that I want to make sure that we don't fall into is like if an EM has a relatively small maintenance backlog for their team, right? They don't have to allocate any percentage of engineers towards maintenance, right? So like for the larger scale initiatives that require resources from multiple teams or aren't discretely associated with any particular set of teams, making sure that we have some mechanism to encourage EMs to allocate their engineers' time towards those initiatives, even if their team isn't directly impacted.
Yeah, so like we're not setting targets yet in cross-functional prioritization. We're putting the metrics in place and we're just starting with measuring and seeing what's happening. But like the long-term intent is to have healthy targets for maintenance. Like there should be no scenario where a team does zero maintenance for two milestones anymore. That should never happen again. So what I would say is like let's just use what we've got and use like whatever the next one is, whether it's GraphQL or something. Let's use the working group for that. Get the people who can afford to spend their time on it and provide stability throughout the project. And those people create phases of a project, create the issue backlogs, and then get it into cross-functional prioritization. It's like that next release, we're going to execute phase one together. It's going to involve that group of people in the working group and then the teams that are committed to it. And then we're a go. And then if all the teams deliver, we're done with phase one. If one of the team misses, that team was the long pole in the tent and they delayed phase one, right? But I think that's how the project sort of has to be managed.
Makes sense. I've listed the action items coming out of this meeting below. I think I captured everything, but feel free to follow up async if anybody wants to add more detail to those. I'll take point on most of them. I think Andrea was going to run down the front-end RFC process. I'll plan on taking everything else.
Cool. Thanks all.
Yep.